Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. First off, everyone, happy Juneteenth. Today is June 19th, which is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the U.S. So if you are unfamiliar with Juneteenth, back in 1865, on June 19th, Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, and informed everyone that the war had ended and that enslaved individuals were free at that time. This was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued by President Lincoln. That had become official on January 1st of 1863. But over in Texas, there were not that many Union troops around to enforce that new executive order, so a lot of racist folks continued on as they had before and did not free the slaves as they were supposed to. So on June 19th, 1865, when the Union soldiers arrived there in Texas, they informed everyone that all of the slaves were to be set free, and they were there to enforce it as well. So that is why Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery within the U.S., and it started out in Texas. So a lot of times in the U.S., we tend to think of the 4th of July as being Independence Day, and it really being associated with freedom. But Independence Day is from the signing of the Declaration of Independence from 1776. So really that is just about the freedom of white colonists from British rule. It's not truly actually freedom for many Americans, as it would be another 89 years from the signing of the Declaration of Independence before June 19th, 1865, when the slaves were freed. So it's important to recognize Juneteenth, y'all, and I hope you read some more about it on your own to educate yourselves and learn more about an actual celebration of freedom that better represents more Americans than the 4th of July. You can read more about that on juneteenth.com/history.htm. I have also been on the road this past week, driving halfway across the country from Texas to North Carolina, as I am currently in the process of moving. So, that was a long drive. It took me about 3 days, and that's where I've been this past week. I've been all over, honestly, all along the Gulf Coast, and then up through Georgia into North Carolina. I got to see some great friends along the way, and that really made the journey and those stops worthwhile, and now I get to be home with my family for a bit. So I'm sorry about the absence, but here I am now, and we're going to pick up with V-Wars Season 1, Episode 2 today. We're going to start out with our initial recap of what we discussed in Episode 1, and then we are also going to discuss how life is progressing for Dr. Swan and Michael Fane, as they are now somewhat at odds, with Michael Fane having been infected with the virus and turning into a vampire, and Dr. Swan not presenting any symptoms for it. He was asymptomatic, but still was able to transmit it to his wife. And we're going to talk about some similarities between that and COVID-19. So first up, in our last episode, we were introducing the mythology and concepts behind V-Wars. So some of the most important components to consider is that this is partly related to climate change. Dr. Swan is telling us that the type of virus that is being exposed here is as a result of it being a very old one that used to be part of history, and that as the ice caps have been melting, these old viruses that were inactivated just by virtue of being frozen are now coming back around. And indeed, we have found that a lot of different pathogens are able to last for a very long time and to be reanimated later. They can go into a dormant state and then be reactivated years, decades, centuries even later. They just rehydrate these different types of pathogens. So that's what has really happened here. And although both Luther Swan and Michael Fane were exposed to the virus, only Michael Fane has turned, whereas Luther did not get sick, but did pass it on to his wife, Jess, tragically, whom Luther then had to beat to death with an iron poker from the fireplace right in front of his son. And now he's in custody because they think that he is actually with Michael in killing these people. So, we didn't have very long to get attached to Jess, but we saw how much Luther was enamored with her. And this was right after their anniversary. So this happening with Jess tells us two things. One, that you can be an asymptomatic carrier of this virus and infect other people. And two, that it can be transmitted via bodily fluids. We don't know much about the virus yet beyond this. So, Michael is now on the loose and is full-blown vampire, killing some random victims. And Luther is in hot water with the police chief, Mackerlane, because he has murdered his wife, as far as Mackerlane can tell, and Mackerlane trusted him, for whatever reason, to go and get his wife and son and allegedly bring them back safely to protect them from Michael. So Chief Mackerlane is not having a very good day in that he has trusted this man to go and protect his wife, and he ended up murdering her. So since no one else seems to understand that this is a vampire thing going on yet, you know, it does look like Luther just went home and murdered his wife. Because Michael ended up not being anywhere around there at all. Then we see that Luther's son, Desmond, is in Child Protective Services. And Des is letting them know, hey, you know, he was protecting me. Something was wrong with my stepmom and she just went crazy. But they don't want to let him go. Also, the Department of National Security, so it's like the Department of Homeland Security, but made for TV, starts to take over this case. They have seen enough clues to understand that this is Bad News Bears. And so they decide to also take Luther with them. And then a woman named Claire O'Hagan, who is played by Candace McClure, meets with Dr. Swan and knows that he might have a better handle on this than the others do. However, he's pretty much being strong-armed into this, and his son is essentially being held hostage in order to ensure his compliance with them. And while all of this is happening, the journalist Kaylee Vo, played by Jackie Lale, is investigating these vampire killings. She runs a story on Michael's attacks, and weirdly, through most of the story, they refer to Michael by his first and last name, Michael Fane. Although I think that that is wholly intentional, as largely he's just portrayed on the television in these exposés on the news and saying that he is a serial killer. So everyone knows his first and last name, and whenever he meets people, they go, "You're Michael Fane," because they don't know him as a person. They know him as a symbol. He's a household name, but he's not necessarily a person to them. And that is also how our news tends to operate in everyday life. Kaylee is still investigating those vampire killings, though, and publishing them on her website using inside information she is getting from Jurgen. So she runs a story on the attacks, and she saw these attacks while she was speaking with him in the hospital when he was strapped down onto the bed. So she saw everything that happened and him throwing the person over the balcony and using them to also kind of pad his landing, even as he had also used them as a meat shield. So Kaylee is now right in the thick of things and is more convinced than ever that these are vampires. So far, Dr. Swan, Luther, Kaylee, and the Department of National Security are the only folks who are really on this vampire trail. So when Kaylee runs this story, her helper, Les, who seems to be working with the police or is a policeman of some sort, helps her get into the crime scene that is the Swan house following the murder of Jess. So he's meant to be there and just make sure nothing untoward happens, but ultimately he is, still crooked, and he's getting paid by Kaylee for access to this area. So Kaylee is going in there and getting some information about Swan when she sees a photo in there of Swan with Michael Fane and sees that they are friends. But even though they are friends, they are closer to being brothers. That's how they describe each other throughout the show. They have a great closeness, at least they did before Michael murdered that woman because of the vampire tendencies, and also when Luther covered up the murder and ultimately ended up going and reporting Michael to the police. So there is a rift in that brotherhood right now, and Luther really just wants more than anything to help Michael. He believes that it's from the virus and that there is something wrong with him and that it's not really truly murder because he is not able to control it. He believes first and foremost in the goodness of his brother, this man he's known his entire life, and that he knows deep down would never actually harm someone willfully and intentionally. And so he knows this is very out of character. And even as he is reporting Michael's attack on this woman to the police, he is still in the same breath defending Michael and letting him know, the police chief that is, that he thinks that Michael is sick. Now, he perhaps could have gone a different way in this, as we talked about in our first episode, but again, you don't really have emergency numbers for social workers or for doctors to really come in and help get these people who need treatment their treatment. You're not allowed to administer that treatment against their will in any way either. And I'm not calling for being able to administer treatment against someone's will, just that, unfortunately, in the case of Luther and Michael, Luther went to the authority that he thought could help them the most in getting Michael treatment. And unfortunately, it is the police, and that is what we face today, is folks just calling on the police when you need anything, no matter what it really is. Is it an emergency and a person's not necessarily bleeding or on fire? Then you call the police. There isn't an alternative. And so Dr. Swan really gets his brother in more trouble by taking the route that he does, because he does not truly see an alternative. We are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about what else Kaylee finds and where Michael is at this time.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about where we left off in episode 1 and also what Kaylee has been getting up to in the meantime. So Kaylee has been searching around the Swan house and has found a picture of Michael and Luther together. And she posts it on a page that's referred to as Revelleaks. So it's supposed to be very similar to the real life site WikiLeaks. And she's seemingly running this site, or is at least a very strong contributor to it. So Kaylee puts this up there, and we meet a guy named Monster, who has been near Michael Fane's motorcycle. So we know now that Michael Fane's dentist had been susceptible to the vampire virus too, and had ultimately succumbed to it. They believe that he killed himself. And Michael Fane had gone to him because he was telling Luther that his teeth were hurting before that. So this guy has been around Michael's motorcycle, and it appears to be also coming down with these super sense symptoms. So he is starting to hear things even clearer and stuff like that. He's also seeing that there are a lot of bodies piling up now, you guys. Michael Fane kills a cop, and it's super easy for him to do so. We saw in the hospital that he has super strength. We also saw that when Michael broke his sink as well. So this was something that was very easy for him to do, and we're seeing his powers perhaps even grow, or just getting to the point where they are leveling out, but they don't appear to be getting weaker in any way at the very least. We also see a scientist referred to as Niklos talking with Luther about Michael. And Luther is just really ruing the fact that he did not keep Michael in quarantine longer, because remember, he didn't want to be released from the quarantine at the time. Luther thought that they needed to be in there even longer, even though they had gone through the normal quarantine period. He believed that there was something off and that they needed to be in there a little bit longer. But unfortunately, they were released, and the doctor could not have known prior to that, the doctor who cleared them to leave, that this would end up happening. This is a novel virus, just like the coronavirus, COVID-19, is a novel virus. So they were not able to truly anticipate precisely how this was going, or to know that they needed to have a longer quarantine period for this in order for the symptoms to truly manifest. So Swan is just very upset about this, but you really would not have been able to keep Michael in anything short of what you would perhaps keep some Batman or Marvel villains in, because Michael has super strength and he has enhanced vision and hearing and a bunch of powers. So he would not really have been held by iron bars even, and definitely not by the plexiglass that was keeping them from Jess and Des when they came to visit. But as he's talking about this to Niklos, he is saying that he thinks it's a prion disease in some sort of biomass that had been collected at that Arctic research station. And he thinks it got into both his wife and Michael, and repeats to him what he was trying to reiterate to the police chief Mackerlane as well, that neither of these people who were very close to him are evil, just that they're sick and they can't control what they're doing. He knows that Jess would never have turned on him and that Michael wouldn't either. He knows that something is definitively off, and he feels that as someone who knows these people as individuals, he is determined and even obligated to re-underline this for the doctors and for the Department of National Security. And Niklos seems somewhat sympathetic to Luther in this. And he, Luther that is, and the DNS really figure out the terms at which they will be having him help them, and how they are really holding his son hostage to make sure that they can leverage him to get Luther to work together. But throughout all of this, Luther just keeps saying, I want to see my son. I want to see my son. He'll only give them bits of information because he knows that his information is his leverage, and he just wants to see his son. And he's really being held hostage. They know all about his work, and the DNS knows that his research and insight into this could be instrumental in helping to solve this growing problem that they're facing, as we've seen that it's highly transmissible so far. They don't really know the exact way that it is spread, but it does appear to be through some type of bodily fluids and through inhalation or respiration. So respiratory droplets and respiration are ways that we can get coronavirus too. This show is very timely in the era in which it has been made from a comic into a TV show. And if it had come out, I think, just a month or so later, I think everyone would have been strongly binging this during quarantine, and we would already have a second season instead of a premature cancellation. Now, Ian Somerhalder et al. Have said that they are continuing to work to bring us a continuation of the series in some type of format, but as is, you're even still able to watch all the way through to the end of season 1 and get some sense of closure. So I don't want you guys to be deterred by the fact that there isn't a season 2 yet on screen. So I need asterisks by both of those to really dissuade you from watching it. I want you guys to go and check this out for yourself. And even if you aren't so keen on watching the show version, start with the graphic novel and then go ahead and watch the show and see how close it is and see if you like it. So, in my opinion, getting more media in this way that has sociocultural references and political references and scientific ones, it can be really difficult to see all of that on screen. And I think that they did a really great job in addressing a lot of that in V-Wars. So if that is kind of your niche, then definitely go check this out, including the on-screen version. You can always pick up with the graphic novels afterwards if you want to know more about what might have happened or might still happen in season 2. So we are here now with Luther and the DNS having decided that Luther is going to work with them in order to be with his son. And it is really kind of foreboding at this point because Niklos is on the phone and has said to the person on the other end of it, after Luther is no longer in the room, of course, that Michael and Des are both expendable. So that's very interesting to me that Michael is expendable, even though he is patient 0. But we'll learn more about this sinister side to the DNS as we proceed. We also get to see Michael speak with a blind woman for a little bit. So he's been on the run for a long time. But this blind woman has not recognized that he is the person from the television, because they say his name on the TV, but they don't have any recordings of him speaking. So she's never heard the voice of the one they call Michael Fane, that they say is out there killing people. And so Michael, who is pretty bloody at this point, goes and sits down with her at a bus stop and talks to her for a while, and is able to just kind of chill for a minute and just be a person. So we can see that the bloodlust, at least the initial bloodlust, has worn off for him. That doesn't necessarily mean he's never going to feed again, but rather that that new vampire bloodlust that we associate with brand new vampires has really subsided for the most part for Michael. He's able to sit there and just be a person with her rather than going through and just ripping her heart out and using her aorta as a straw, like it is a vampire juice box. So Michael clearly has some kind of control right now, and he is working on sorting out how he feels about what's happening to him. There is clearly still a man inside the monster, and he easily really walks away from her without harming her in any way. He really just has a chat and then goes for a walk. So I think that there's a strong message in here so far that's reiterated verbally and expositionally by Luther, but also is shown to us by Michael, that people can be more than one thing, Joel. And that although Michael is now a monster, he is also still the man that he was before. And that this is really something that has been done to him. There is a change that has been made to him as a human to create this monster. It's not really just who he is as a person. He wasn't like this before. And it raises some interesting questions with nature-nurture, especially as it relates to epigenetics. So this is really more of a nurture issue. This prion disease has been effective in changing the expression of one of his genes. And in that way, it's not happening to Luther because Luther perhaps doesn't have that gene, but Jess does. And I also really like in the show that they went ahead and made the second person that we see infected to be a white woman after Michael, who is a black man, was patient 0. Remember, there is no genetic basis for race. There is no single gene that can just determine that you are of a specific race. Race is a sociocultural construct, and it's not a biological one. So I like that they took this approach and they showed that effectively Michael and Jess share this gene from somewhere perhaps way back in their ancestry when these vampires were around before throughout history and vampire lore, and that they both have it. And indeed, anthropology also supports this concept. Anthropology, and specifically the field of genetics within biology, shows us that the proportion of variation in human genetics is more different within population groups than between them. So that very much means that there is more genetic variation between two white folks than between a white person and an African American person. It all comes down to the frequency of genetic data. They are genetic polymorphisms. That means they can take different forms, and they are at different loci or different points on the genes. It's very interesting, And I encourage you guys to check out the journal article from the Journal of Genetics from 2007 called Genetic Similarities Within and Between Human Populations by Witherspoon et al. So that's going to be the Journal of Genetics from Witherspoon et al. 2007 if you would like to read more about why this is that way. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about single nucleotide polymorphisms, what those really mean, and how these differences are determined in humans. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the wars and the difference in epigenetics between Luther and Michael and the similarities between Michael and Jess. So now we're going to talk a little bit about genetic variation within and between groups and how our genetic evidence and our DNA are really associated with evolution and what that means for us as the human species. So, thanks to the popularity of shows like CSI in the 90s and early 2000s, and now a lot of these crime podcasts that are out there, we know that DNA is essentially a fingerprint for our identity, and we're all really closely related to each other. And that's also true for lots of organisms. DNA is what makes up an organism's genome in the nucleus of every cell of living things. For different creatures like viruses, that's going to be RNA instead. We're talking about these living organisms like humans, or cats, or chimpanzees. And these genes within the nucleus make up the genome, and the genes are the codes for protein, and proteins are the building blocks of our tissues and how they function. So this is expressed and manipulated by how these proteins are folded and also what they are made up of. So the timing and degree and shapes of protein making can regulate the output of our genes. And our DNA can really strongly impact how an organism grows and how its blood, bone, brains, and so on are expressed phenotypically and how they develop as time goes on. DNA is also really important in the study of evolution. And by evolution, I mean the changes in a species over long periods of time. So not just between a generation or two, but really for centuries, millennia. We're talking about deep time, you guys. And it takes a long time for these changes to accumulate and result in speciation, or a divergence from one species into another. And the amount of differences in our DNA is something we can use to measure between one species and another, how closely or distantly related that they and or we are. So we can measure how different we are from chimpanzees or bonobos. And there aren't that many differences genetically between individual humans today. It's very, very small, about 0.1% on average. And so this study of chimpanzee genomes indicates that there is a difference of about 1.2%. And bonobos, who are the close cousins of chimpanzees and some of the closest cousins of humans, are only different from humans by that same 1.2%. The DNA difference with gorillas is about 1.6%. And humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees all have the same amount of difference from gorillas. It doesn't necessarily mean the exact same genes, but it does mean that we are the same amount of different from the gorillas, as the gorillas are from chimpanzees, and as the bonobos are from gorillas. There's also a difference of 3.1% between us and the African great apes from the Asian great ape, the orangutan. So that is also very interesting, as we believe that human life also originated on the African continent. So there is a very interesting implication in evolution as you start to stack up these genetic differences and look at it by the numbers as well as by the genes. So all of the great apes and the humans tend to differ from rhesus monkeys by about 7% in our DNA. So bonobos and chimpanzees and even gorillas and orangutans as great apes are all about 7% different from rhesus monkeys, because monkeys and apes are not the same thing. They are, however, both primates, just as humans are. So in anthropology, we often refer to primates as being human and non-human primates. So we're all still primates, we're still animals, we're just human animals, just like apes are ape-type animals. So a lot of research has been done over the years regarding genetics, and geneticists have found a multitude of ways to calculate the percentage differences between us and also to indicate our similarities. The 1.2% difference between chimps and humans is a measurement of just the substitutions in the building blocks of genes that chimpanzees and humans share. But if you look at the entire genome, you can see that long segments of DNA have been deleted or duplicated or inserted from one part of a genome into the other. And if you count those differences, that's an additional about 4 to 5% difference between human and chimpanzee genomes. So it doesn't matter really how the calculation is performed. The primary point is still valid, that humans and chimps and bonobos are more closely related to one another than either are to gorillas or to other primates. And it just really is a matter of scale, whether you're looking at the genes that are shared and how those building blocks, those proteins are different, or if you are looking at the scale of the entire genome. It is still correlating each time. There's still that same amount of difference between those certain groups and the great apes like the gorillas that are separate from the bonobos and the chimpanzees and the humans. So from that perspective, you can really do a lot of studies on biological kinship. And we're not cousins of the great apes. Humans are great apes. The DNA evidence really shows us what it is on paper, and that's that the line between human and non-human is very small. It's very shallow. The divide between apes and humans is minuscule because the human evolutionary tree is within the one of the great apes. Now, this is not necessarily saying that humans came from apes or humans came from monkeys. A lot of folks misconstrue evolution and take a really reductionist approach in saying that in order to more easily refute it. But it's not actually true. That's not entirely how evolution works. But we do share so many genes with the fellow great apes in our human origins. There is such a strong similarity between humans and the African great apes that Charles Darwin predicted in 1871 that Africa was the most likely place where human lineage branched off from other animals. So where the common ancestor of chimps, humans, bonobos, and gorillas lived at one point. And the DNA evidence really does support what Darwin had supposed at the time. The African great apes have a closer kinship bond with one another, including humans, than the African apes have with orangutans, the Asian great apes, or even any other type of primate. So it's a very bold scientific prediction just made on phenotype by Charles Darwin in 1871, and it was considered to be so wild at the time. I'm sure a lot of folks looked at him like Agent Mulder from the X-Files and were like, this man is wild. And he's like, the truth is out there. I think that pretty much just sums up Charles Darwin in a nutshell. So he's just like, the truth is out there. And he believed he had found it then. And genetics today supports this thing that Darwin put forth 150 years ago. And that is that human evolution began in Africa. The DNA evidence that informs this conclusion is accompanied by fossil evidence as well. So as a biological anthropologist, I have studied this a lot over the years in my undergraduate and my master's degree, and we see that Europe and Asia have been extensively dug through, they've been excavated to try to find early human fossils, but they have really only discovered that the first 4 million years or so of human evolutionary history took place exclusively on the African continent. Believe me, the Europeans tried. They wanted very much to believe that life had started in Europe, because that really would have more easily fit any notions of racism or colonialist approaches. But in fact, all of the DNA evidence and fossil evidence supports the idea that all of the beginnings of human evolutionary history took place on the African continent. And that's where a lot of biological anthropologists, specifically paleoanthropologists, search for fossils that are near that branching point, that missing link between where human lineages came from and where chimpanzee lineages came from and where we truly diverge from each other. We're looking for our last common ancestor. And due to just billions of years of evolution, we share genes with all living organisms, by the way. So we share more with our fellow great apes, especially those from the African continent, but then secondarily, those from the Asian continent, and then other primates. But we also share a lot of genes with other living organisms. You've likely heard that we share genes with bananas and also worms. And that's true. But we also share more genes with organisms that are more closely related to us. So the primates and the great apes, specifically of the group that humans belong to, are one of the major groups of the primate evolutionary tree. And there are similarities in both anatomy and in behavior and in biological kinship. So this is like a biopsychosocial component. It's totally holistic. And that is why anthropology is really helpful in sorting through that, because it's a holistic perspective and it takes a really well-rounded approach in studying these differences and similarities. But we see a lot of DNA evidence here that really supports that our closest living biological relatives are chimps and bonobos. But we didn't directly evolve from any of the primates that live today. So no one is saying that we evolved from gorillas or from chimps and bonobos. Merely that we at one point had a common ancestor and we diverged from them about 8 to 6 million years ago. And the last common ancestor between monkeys and apes was about 25 million years ago. And that's why we are closer to other apes, especially the great apes, than we are to other primates. And by that, I'm mostly talking about monkeys. So monkeys are totally different from apes. You can read all about that online if you're curious. But I just wanted to get that point across today as we are talking about evolution in our discussions of V-Wars. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to discuss V-Wars, COVID-19, and our current sociocultural climate, in addition to some more information about genetics between fellow humans. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the differences between human ancestors and our fellow cousins, the great apes within the primate group. So now we're going to talk some more about the DNA similarities between fellow humans, and we're also going to talk about the sociocultural climate of V-Wars and modern-day America, as well as similarities between this disease and COVID-19. So as we discussed, we have those building blocks of DNA, and they make us who we are. There are 3 billion base pairs for DNA. We've discussed before how those are GATC, just like has been represented in the movie Gattaca, which if you haven't seen it, I recommend that one. I'm probably going to cover that in a future podcast. But of these 3 billion base pairs of these nucleotides, those GATCs, there are only a tiny bit of them that are unique to us. And that makes us as individuals 99.9% genetically similar to the human next to us. Remember, the genetic variation between humans is only about 0.1% from human to human, and from chimpanzee to human, only about 1 to 2% when we are measuring it between the genes that we share and how those proteins, those building blocks, are also varied. So there was a recent TED Talk by a physicist and entrepreneur named Riccardo Sabatini, and he showed that a printed version of your entire genetic code would be about 262,000 pages. That's like 175 large books, or, a couple of long sci-fi fan fictions, I suppose. But of those pages, only about 500 out of 262,000 would be unique to each individual human. And that is because huge parts of our genome are meant to perform similar functions across the animal kingdom. And when we talk about anatomy and physiology, that truly means structure and function. So a lot of the structure is the same, and that's because a lot of the functions are the same. We all need to breathe in some way. We need to perform respiration. We need to make sure we can digest things. And you can see how genetically similar we are to everything around us based on just a couple of numbers. So chimpanzees, if we look at their genome, their full genome, instead of just the genes that we have in common with them, remember that variability is going to be about 4 to 5%. So chimpanzees are about 96% genetically similar to humans. And that's according to a 2005 study. And this one is my favorite. Cats are 90% similar to humans, at least in the Abyssinian domestic cat, compared to humans. So we share 90% of our DNA with that specific type of domestic cat. And that's according to a 2007 study that I'm very excited about. And as a general rule, I don't like to get my DNA typed or anything like that, because if you give out your genetic data, a lot of companies then own the rights to your DNA data, and then they can also go ahead and start patenting different treatments and things like that based off of your genes, and I have an ethical problem with that. So I don't like to give out that information, and they can do whatever they want with it as well. You sign over your rights when you submit your cheek swab over to a lot of these ancestry websites. So if I have to get my DNA swabbed for work, that's different if you're working in forensics. But if I am going to be handing it over to a private company, that's going to be a no-go for me. Otherwise, y'all know I would be there right now swabbing my cat's cheek too, to see how much of my genes I share with Little Bear. But that's wild that we are 90% similar to Abyssinian cats. And if we look at those protein encoding genes, where that 1.2% number comes from for chimpanzees and bonobos and humans, then we see that mice are 85% similar to humans. If you look at non-coding genes, so their full genome, then that's only about 50%. It just depends. The National Human Genome Research Institute says that this similarity is because we probably had a shared ancestor about 80 million years ago. So when we started out, there weren't that many different types of creatures, is the basic principle, and that they evolved to certain ecological niches. And evolution isn't targeted in that way, but it's not doing it on purpose, is what I mean. It's rather that certain types of changes are advantageous or disadvantageous. And when those happen, it can make you more likely to be able to pass on your genes or to reach the point of reproductive age to be able to pass on your genes. And then you are more likely to reproduce and have those genes shared through generations and proliferate until we can reach the point millions of years later that there is some form of genetic divergence on the speciation level of the scale. We share about 80% of our genes with domesticated cattle as well. And when it comes to insect DNA, we share about 61% of disease-causing genes with fruit flies. So this might sound like a weird thing to study, but it's important for when you're doing genetic research, or even for things like when NASA was studying bugs to see what space travel might do to human genes. and they're using flies as a proxy for human genes. They've also sent up different types of flowers, and they've sent up jellyfish, and these animals that reproduce much more quickly than humans and can go through several F generations can really tell us a lot. But we do need to know the level of genetic similarity in order to draw these true comparisons and to measure the degree to which these correlations are actually significant. With the jellyfish, this is more of an aside, but one of my favorite types of projects. So they sent these jellyfish up, and they found that within a single generation, the jellyfish were not able to really function well in water. They couldn't move around properly, the children that were born up in space. So even within a single generation, it was enough of a difference experientially to really significantly impact these creatures. So they do lots of these little side projects up there in the International Space Station as well. They're not just up there looking at the stars. They're also trying to study how space travel and space living might impact humans by doing twin studies, as they've been recently doing, but also by looking at how other animals change out there and then comparing them to how similar they are to humans. We share about 60% of genes with chickens, and we also share about 60% of DNA with bananas, as I mentioned earlier. So with those genetic similarities within and between humans specifically, those can be insertions, deletions, etc. And really, it is just telling us that we are more similar than we are different. The difference between human population groups is largely due to geography. It's that clinal variation that Livingston talked about 100 years ago. So when he was talking about this, it's just that geographic differences in these clines or latitudes are what are resulting in differences in melanin deposition or in your height or your stoutness, as in the case of Allen and Bergman's rules. And these are important for recognizing these differences with individuals. So there are actually more differences between folks who are in that same group than there are between different population groups. And there have been many studies on this throughout the years that support this. A lot of folks think that this is controversial for some reason, and some geneticists outright disagreed. Some thought that the differences were negligible, but it really became apparent that even by using a modest number of these loci, these locations where these genes are, it can allow some type of assignment to different ancestry groups. So we can see the common ancestor groups that we have with different types of animals or other organisms, including bananas. But also, we can do that with our fellow primates. So the Human Genome Project in 2001 was really illuminating and highlighting the basic genetic similarity of all humans. And we saw that we can really use DNA data to classify humans in a few different ways. And you can show why this accurate classification works, despite the slight differences in allele frequencies between populations. So it's really suggesting that if you look at enough loci, then two individuals from the same population may be genetically more similar or more closely related in that biological kinship analysis to each other than to any individual from another population. They state that two Caucasians are more similar to each other genetically than a Caucasian and an Asian individual in Risch et al. 2002. But They reanalyzed that data from 377 microsatellite loci that they typed in 1,056 individuals, and they found that Europeans were more similar to Asians than to other Europeans 38% of the time, and that the population definitions and data that they used came from Rosenberg et al. 2002. So by getting these larger data sets and having access to the human genome through projects like the HGP, we are able to evaluate these contrasts quantitatively and look at pairwise relatedness measures so we can really see a distinction between populations if we use enough of those loci that can have different sets of alleles there, those polymorphisms that we were talking about earlier. So you can see these classification errors as well and truly measure them. And it really indicates the rates of the numbers of loci. That's what's correlating with these classification rates. And those classification rates are really correlating with the number of those loci that you're looking at. So if folks are asking the question of how often a pair of individuals from one population is genetically more dissimilar than two individuals from two different populations, then that depends on the number of polymorphisms that you use to really observe that dissimilarity, and also in looking at the populations that you compare. So if you use 10 loci, so 10 locations with these genes, and 3 different populations, and the full spectrum of polymorphisms, then about 1/3 of the time, they are going to be more dissimilar within the group than they are between groups. If you use 100 loci, that answer is about 20% of the time. And if you use 1,000 loci, that's still only 10%. So if genetic similarity is measured over thousands of loci, then that answer may be never if the individuals are from geographically separated populations. But if you look at the entire world population, if you include a lot of these closely related and admixed populations, that number would strongly increase. So it's important that we're actually looking at these numbers and the similarities. It's going to tell us the aggregate properties of the populations, and not just the properties of individuals, or even paired up individuals when they're randomly paired. A lot of times they use the centroid classification method, and that will compute the distance between individuals and the population centroid, or the population average, and then it will do a cluster analysis of individuals around the nearest centroid. And that population trait method relies on information about the frequencies of each allele in each population to compute the individual trait values and to examine the mean and variance of the distribution of those traits along that spectrum to really classify individuals. It's really something that goes pretty far deep. I encourage you guys to read more about it in your own time. But the point is that given enough genetic data, you can get a different result. If you're looking at absolutely all of the DNA and you're comparing just 2 randomly chosen individuals, it's going to look differently than if you use the comparison to the average. And you're looking at how closely does this individual fit to the average individual of this population group. And also, if this individual has to be assigned to one of the population groups present, what is the likelihood that they fit into each of these? And we refer to that a lot of times as being your posterior probability and your typicality. How probable is it, and how typical is this individual of each of these groups? How probable is it that it belongs to this group, assuming that it has to belong to one of these groups? And how typical are this individual's features when compared against the centroid, or the average of individuals for the group to which it was assigned? So they say that you should be really careful when using geographic or genetic ancestry to make inferences about how individuals look. So don't confuse genotype with phenotype. There are also epigenetics at play too that can really make a big difference there. And there are concepts of race that are correlated with geographic ancestry, but you cannot interchange the two, and you cannot use these racial classifications to predict how close people are to each other. Remember, race is also a sociocultural construct. It's not a biological one. So we can see some differences between folks from different geographic areas, but a lot of that is also going to be related to epigenetics and just declinal variation, and not necessarily down to genetics, because you're only seeing the gene expressions. You are seeing the phenotypes. You're not seeing the underlying actual genes, the blueprints that people are built from. As we get further into V-Wars, we're going to see this pop up more and more, and then talk about genetics and genotype and phenotype, and also epigenetics and prions. And although COVID-19 is a virus, and this is a prion disease, it's a protein disease, it's still very similar in many ways regarding how one can be asymptomatic and still spread it to others, and so how it's important that precautions are made. We're also going to see some different types of this gene expression, of this phenotypic variation that is going to become more apparent as time goes on, and we see more of the story unfold. We're going to get to see things like how the different characters have different alleles for this. So they're looking at those loci and they're seeing that they are polymorphic. So there can be different types of alleles there that are going to express similarly, but not entirely the same, and how that works within groups and between groups. I really like V-Wars in that they have taken a very hardcore approach to putting science in sci-fi, but also they've taken a holistic approach, because there is also a ton of sociocultural information in there, and we see a lot of parallels in what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and the othering of groups, as we see Michael and the others trying to discover who they are within this system and within this new world that they're facing, and how that relates politically, how these other individuals are treating them in the disparities to equity. So whether that be health equity or being viewed as being disproportionately criminals, even though there are some vampires who don't drink human blood. It's very in-depth in the approach that it takes, and I am stoked to explore this more with you guys in future episodes. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.